Methodology in the research proposal. The next most important part of a proposal is the methodology. How you actually intend to do the research or the methods of doing the research. Here we'll explore few sections when explained would help us prepare the methodology. The contents and methodology would be as such. Research or study design, study context, place, time of study, the participants or the samples, sample size calculation, and the variables and measurement. Further, the participants and samples can be subdivided into population, definition of cases and controls or definition of test and controls, selection criteria for inclusion and exclusion of population as well as cases and controls, sampling technique for representativeness and generalizability. Further, variables and measurement can be further subclassified or will be divided into few sections like description of variables, what are variables as, data collection techniques, data collection instruments, data entry, data analysis means statistical tests. Research or study design. Basically, there are two types of research design or study design, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative research. Qualitative research is primarily a exploratory research. It is used to gain an understanding of the underlying reasons, opinions, and motivations. It provides insights into the problem or helps to develop ideas or hypotheses for potential quantitative research. And let me remind you that qualitative is less performed by students in general. Quantitative research is used to quantify the problem by way of generating numerical data or data that can be transformed into usable statistics. It is used to quantify attitudes, opinions, behaviors, and other defined variables and generalize results from a larger sample population. Let me remind you that qualitative is done in a select small sample and it gives a varied output, whereas a quantitative research is done in a larger sample. Quantitative research has two broad study categories. One in which the investigator actively changes some aspects, called the intervention study, and the other where information is gathered only by observation and is called as observational studies. So experimental studies are usually termed as randomized controlled trials. Trials means there is an intervention happening, and observational studies can be called as cross-sectional studies. Select the study design based on the research question and hypothesis. Further, this lecture series will explore on the quantitative methods more commonly performed by students than qualitative. So what is an experimental study design? Here there is an intervention. There is an intentional intervention where the investigator tries to make a change and study how this change is having an effect. Change is designed by the researcher for evaluating how the change will have an effect or impact. In the simplest form, there are two groups, an intervention group or a test group where the change happens and the other control group where no change happens. The outcome is compared between the test and control group, which will tell us how the intervention or the change affected the outcome. For example, let us take an example. You have the effect of scaling on periodontitis. So scaling is a intervention. So in one group you perform scaling and the other group, the control group, you don't perform a scaling. And you see if scaling resolves periodontitis. So if a hypothesis is to be made, we'll be saying that scaling leads to resolution of periodontitis. And if this hypothesis is true, then the scaling group or the test group will have less disease compared to the control group. So the outcome, as I said, is the resolution of the periodontal disease and is compared between the two groups at about 3 months follow-up or 6 months follow-up after the treatment in the test group. The test and control group differ only by the intervention or the change, or otherwise they are similar except for the intervention in the test group. So coming to the observational study design, the major another category of a quantitative research. So in this, there is no intervention. There is only observation of two groups of participants or objects if non-human subject studies are being performed based on some difference In the simplest form, again, there are two groups: cases in which there is an exposure of interest, and in the control group where the exposure of interest is not there. So the outcome of interest is compared between case and control. So case and control differ only by the presence or absence of an exposure. Exposure can be something like a risk factor. Now this comparison will tell us how the exposure or the risk factor affected the outcome. Again, going with an example of smoking on periodontitis. Let us say the exposure is smoking and we hypothesize that smoking affects periodontitis or it worsens periodontitis. So in the case group, it will be smokers, and the control group would be non-smokers, and we will be comparing the smokers cases and non-smokers control on the presence of periodontitis. So if a hypothesis is true, more smokers should have periodontitis than non-smokers. So various types of observational studies are there, which include ranges from ecological, where there are no cases and controls, and we just see if there is any association with anything with the disease of interest, where no cases and controls are defined, and cross-sectional studies where comparison is done between cases and controls. Cases, I said, are persons who have the exposure, and controls are those who don't have the exposure. Others include a case control study and longitudinal studies. For more details, please look into courses on study designs. Let us go to the next activity. Select the most appropriate study design for this research. Send the Word file after finishing the next part of activity 6. If you do not have the Word file, scan the QR code and access the Word file and follow the instructions. Pause the video now if you want to access the code.